Hey everybody, this is Modern Refugee. I am home a little under the weather, so I thought I would do a middle of the day live stream with you guys and talk about some of the old items that I still use here for preparedness. Hey there, Library Lizard, how you doing? I The wife and I came down with something that is going around here locally. We uh, we went to our doctor yesterday, and they said that they had 20 people in there that all had the exact same thing that we did. So, that's what bringing people together for the holidays does, I guess, is it gets everybody sick. And, well, I called off work yesterday. I don't call off to work very often, but I was coughing so bad I couldn't. But they got us squared away. So, I'm kind of a busybody. Even when I'm homesick, I try to do something that keeps me busy. Hey there, Coney. Hey there, 1776. How you guys doing? I just thought I'd do a little mid-afternoon live stream here with you guys. Hey, prepping preacher. Yeah, like I said, I was a little bit under the weather, but I'm still a busybody, so I like keeping busy with whatever I can do, even though I'm sick. Hi, Mike Tango Whiskey. How you doing today? It's got to be pretty early out there where you guys are out on the West Coast. I guess it's probably what 11 o'clock out there. You guys are probably doing good. Yeah, I thought Mike Tango Whiskey. He's a big axe man. He's always got the old axes and stuff that he picks up on his channel. So if you like axes, he's probably the guy to check out. Yep, 11 o'clock out there. So I guess I did do my math. Anyway, I thought I would show you guys. Some of the items that I still use for my preparedness that are well classified antiques and kind of how mom and dad used them. And these items that everything that I'm going to show you here at one point or another has showed up in one of my videos. Yeah, 2 o'clock live. I know I'm a little off here from the 7 o'clock ones, but I had time, so I figured I would go ahead and do this. The first thing I'm going to start showing you guys here is kind of the woodworking tools. And I guess I'll start out with this one. And this guy right here, this is what's called a draw knife. And what a draw knife is used for is shaping wood. I can make a board with this. If I had to, I could make a board with this. I would keep a nice edge on this guy here. It's got a little couple of notches and a couple of cracks in the blade, but this I have a couple of these, but this is the one that I still use and works the best for me. And like taking bark off of trees and whatnot. But when I was a kid growing up, and I seen, dad and my mother and my grandmother and stuff. If they needed something, they needed like a handle, or they needed a like a clothesline pole, or if they needed a post to put in the ground for the chicken yard, or if they needed any of these small wood type things, they wouldn't go to the lumber yard. They would go out to the woods and they would cut down a small tree or whatever, and they would shape it with a draw knife. They would shape it, get it to the general shape that they needed it to be. Then they would take a rasp, which is basically just like a real heavy file, and they would shape it more for the the fine tuning of it, and they would use it. They didn't go to the lumber yard to buy like a dowel, or even sometimes like if they needed something that was kind of like a 2x4 but didn't have to be exactly a 2x4, they would shape it with a draw knife and they would use it. And this is one of the draw knives that does this. And I did a video way back in the day where I showed making a handle for one of my hatchets out of basically a piece of ash firewood, basically off of my wood pile, because we have a lot of dead ash around here, and ash is one of the main woods that they use for handles on materials. But yeah, this is a draw knife that is one of my main tools here that I use. Say hello to everybody in here. Hey, Candace. Rip Curl, how you doing today? Good to see you, my friend. Hey, Coffee First. 11 Kitties. JD Prepping. How is everybody today? Now I'm going to show you one of the bigger items that I got out here. Got to stand up for this one. And there's a little bit of a story behind this. This is a one-man crosscut saw. Now, a one-man, everybody knows a two-man crosscuts that got the handles on both ends and two guys use it. Well, this is the one-man version of this, and it could actually be used as a two-man. That's what this other hole is here for. You would put another handle in here, and then two guys could use this instead of just one. But this was probably the most used large saw back on the farm when I was growing up, and it's actually missing one of the screws right here, but I've still used this multiple times. And the thing with this one-man crosscut saw here, this is the kind of saws that you would use if you had to cut a lot of firewood by hand. You would cut rounds with this guy right here. You would have some type of sawhorse, and then you would have this guy. And one guy could cut his firewood for the night or whatever. And I was pretty fortunate. Even this guy looks here because it's got a big old patina on it, from years and years of use. When I was about 20 years old or so, we had an old guy around here. His name was Frank, and he sharpened saws. He was a professional saw sharpener. That's what he did. He sharpened chainsaw chains. He sharpened hand saws. He sharpened saws like this. Well, he had a stroke, and he wasn't doing very well, and he kept working even though he wasn't doing very good, and he lost his ability to speak because of that stroke, but he still sharpened saws. And I actually took this saw up to him, and I went into his little garage shop that he had. It was called Frank's Sharp Shop is what he called it. And I went in there and I asked Frank if he would sharpen this saw and then one of my two-man crosscut saws, if he would sharpen these and get these blades back up to where they needed to be. And he did sharpen these for me. And about 8 months later, he passed away. So I got an actual old school sharpening on this guy before he passed away. And to this day, this saw, I don't use it that much, but when I do use it, it's sharp. It's still ready to go here. But I wanted to show this to you guys. Like I said, this made it, these items here have made it into come up my videos over the years here. But that one-man crosscut right there, if SHTF did happen and we had to, me and my adult children would have to go out and cut firewood out of our woods, we could cut some wood with that. And then if there were smaller pieces, we could use a buck saw. And, buck saws are pretty popular now because all the bushcrafters make those and stuff. But those guys are pretty decent. See, we got all coming in here. Oh, mother refugees here, keeping me on the straight and narrow. Hey, Vester, I have a couple of draw knives and a one-man, two-man saw, hand drilled, hand bits. Yeah, I have bit and braces, and I have the regular hand drills and stuff. Those actually come in pretty handy as well. But now everybody goes with the power ones and whatnot. And then this one here is a little hand tool, but this guy. This is a fish scaler, and this is actually, a lot of them, the fish scalers nowadays that you see there are those little stamped ones, but this is a cast iron fish scaler, and this was actually used quite a bit, especially in the spring, because the old timers, they would can sucker when sucker would run here. Sucker fish there's a whole native legend with sucker fish, Anishinaabe legend, and the sucker fish, the legend basically goes, it was a very harsh winter, and the Anishinaabe asked the sucker fish if they could help them basically not starve, and the sucker fish said, yes, we'll help you. And that's what caused the sucker fish to run in the springtime, in March and April, in the little creeks and rivers and brooks and stuff that we have up here, would cause the suckerfish to come up and to spawn. And then it was easy for the natives, for the Anishinaabe and the Ojibwe and the Ottawa and stuff to harvest these fish. And then they would, of course, smoke them back then. But the old timers, they would can sucker, and canned sucker is very similar to canned whitefish and canned salmon, but you had to scale those fish, and this is what they used for scaling those fish. And my father, he scaled tons of fish with this guy right here, whether it was perch, whether it was whatever, walleye, pike, panfish, sucker, whitefish, whatever. He would use this to to scale them. And this is one of those, old school tools that I still have here. And another thing that I got here that I want to show you guys, and this has showed up in videos too here. This is a coffee grinder, and I have two of these. And these old school coffee grinders were actually pretty popular. Most of the old farms had one of these in one variety or another. We're talking, years before Maxwell House and stuff came up. But the thing that always got me with these is they just didn't use these to grind coffee. They would use these to grind grain. And my mother would literally spend hours with one of these to crack corn for the chickens. And, she would put whole corn in here, put it on its, highest setting, and she would crunch that up to make cracked corn for the chickens. And then she would mix that cracked corn into her chop or whatever else she was feeding the chickens. And that's what she used these for. And I have found these to be extremely good at grinding wheat. So if I want to make flour, or I want to grind bulgur, or I want to, grind some of those grains to make my own flour, these things actually work pretty good. You can only do a cup or two at a time, but you only need about 4 cups to make a loaf of bread. So these guys have, found their way into different grain grinding videos and stuff of mine, but these guys work really good. And you actually adjust your grind by this little knob up here that adjusts it finer or coarser. And then that opening right there is where you put your grain in, and then the little shelf here, this is where your grain, your flour goes into. And like I said, I really think everybody should have one of these, even if it's a modern one. People should have some of these around so they can actually grind grain. If SHTF happens, this is a really good hand way to make yourself flour. Plus, of course, it also works for grinding your coffee if you got whole coffee beans. And everybody knows that whole wheat berries and whole coffee beans and stuff last a lot longer than anything that is ground. And another thing that I got here, and this I know you guys have probably seen in one of my canning videos, but this is a canning funnel, and it's an old school canning funnel. These are all plastic nowadays, but this is an aluminum one, and this is what I use to can pretty much any of my whatever pickles or bread and butter pickles or anything that I'm canning. I'll use this, and it's got a spout on here if I want to can liquid stuff, but I can also unscrew this, take it off, so it's a larger funnel to can, stuff like potatoes or pears or anything like that. That's what this is for. And this thing works so good. I have not found any reason why I should buy a modern new plastic one, because this has been sort of the main one that I have always used. Glassware and that kind of stuff, things like Crocks. I mean, if you've been on my channel any bit of time, you know that I love Crocks. And Crocks were something that were all over our place when I was a kid growing up, and they were at the old place too, at grandma and grandpa's. And Crocks were basically used to store food, whether it was fermented, whether it was for making corned beef, whether it was for larding meat. All those things required a crock. And the other thing that Crocks were good for was honing knives. And this is one of the knives that was in Mom's drawer when I was a kid growing up. And this is very close to what a Kephart style knife is, even though it's a lot thinner. It was made more for kitchen and utility use, but this is very similar to a Kephart. And if you don't know what a Kephart knife is, Horace Kephart was sort of one of the fathers of modern bushcraft and wrote books and stuff. And I actually have a modern Kephart style knife in my knife collection. This is actually an SCPR4. And that is a modern Kephart style knife, a little bit thicker, so it can be used for woodcraft. And this is actually one of my favorite outdoor knives. But because it's got this spear point, it does a really good job of things like splitting cabbage and, drilling little holes and piercing. It's very good for that. And you can see here how close those guys are to one another in shape and size. The only thing that is different is the thickness of the blade. Mom's one that she had in the utility drawer and in the knife drawer when I was a kid growing up is a little bit thinner, so it's much easier for slicing things with this. But you can see here how close those are, and if I can get in the frame there, you can see how close those guys are. And those Kephart style knives have become extremely popular in the modern, in the modern day, because this was a universally liked shape, because you could do so many different things with this. But the one thing, there was always a crock on our stove or on the counter when I was a kid growing up, and they would run the knife across the edge of the crock, and that would actually hone the knife. I'm going to do this here a few times. I'm going to show you the edge of this crock, because it's actually removing material off that knife. And hopefully the camera can pick it up. You can see that little dark spot right there. That is material that is coming off the knife blade, and I am actually honing this. So whenever mom or grandma would use a knife, they would run it across the lip of the crock. They would run it across the lip of the crock there to put a little bit of an edge on it. And then the other thing that I remember Crocks being for in the kitchen especially was for collecting fat. So if there was any bacon grease, there was any tallow, or there was any fat that came off any meat that was cooked or whatever, that was collected in a crock, because what was collected in the crock then was strained, was melted, strained out, and then that fat was used for making soap. So, the crocks were the kind of the holding receptacles for that fat, where people could save that then and use that to make soap. And there were so many dishes and bowls when I was a kid that was growing up. They were all glazed pottery like that. There wasn't a lot of glass or Pyrex, or there was no plastic whatsoever, and like stamped metal and stuff. None of that stuff was what do I say? None of that stuff was um, throw out. I mean, you used it. You used that stuff. Once you bought a crock, you use that crock until something happened to it, till it broke or whatever. And that's the thing nowadays. Nowadays, everything is disposable and throw out. A couple other crock things that I got here. They're crock similar, but there were dishes. And when I say dishes, dishes were a lot like this. And the thing with these glazed dishes like this is these guys could take a little bit of heat. So if you had to put these guys in an oven or something and make something in these, you could. And this one here is particularly nice because it has the actual lid with it. And I remember this one in particular, this lidded bowl. Mom would make, if she would make like chili sauce, or she would make coleslaw or cabbage or something, that would go in this. She would make it. And then, of course, if it was like coleslaw, you'd want that to sit a little bit. And coleslaw, what we had back on the farm, is not like the coleslaw that you get in the restaurant. Now, the coleslaw that we had, that was diced up into little squares about this big, the cabbage, and it was a little bit of sugar and a little bit of apple cider vinegar, usually homemade, and that was mixed up with a little bit of celery seed, and then that was actually what was put on the cabbage and was tossed. And sometimes, if they wanted to make it really fancy, like for for a like a Fourth of July picnic or whatever, they would cut a little bit of carrot in there fine, so it would have a little bit of color to go along with that. But then they would put the lid on it. If I don't knock it down here, they would put the lid on that, and then that would, cover it and keep it cool for whatever that they were doing. Keep the flies off of it if they were having a meal outside or whatever. MR, no problem with mixing tallow with lard and then making soap. It was always fat. They would melt everything together. Like it didn't really matter whether it was, bacon grease, or if it was beef fat or whatever they had. They would melt all that together, and then they would strain it to make sure there were no bits of whatever bits of meat or brown or crust or whatever in there. They would strain that a couple of times till they had basically a clear fat liquid, usually kind of yellowish color. And the thing with lard or fat soaps like that is they had a tendency to be a very yellowish color. They had if you go buy a bar of Fels NAFTA soap and you look at what that looks like now, take that about I'd say 3 shades darker. That's what the old soap, and because that was from the, the cooked fat and tallow and grease and whatever that they had that they collected, because they didn't really, like separate all the greases and everything. They just dumped that all together. And when they wanted to make a batch of soap, they would use that. The only thing that would be different is if they would add things into it for certain reasons. And the main one was pine tar. Pine tar was something that was added to the soap because that made a very medicinal soap. And I've actually done videos on making pine tar soap too. They would take pine tar, when people still used horse teams for stuff. Pine tar was something that was readily available. And then that pine tar in the soap, that was an actual medication for your skin. So if you had any type of eczema, or you had like a poison ivy started or something like that, that pine tar soap had healing properties that would, take care of your skin. And that was, kind of my take on that. And then of course the lye, I know you can leach lye. I can't remember Mom and Grandma ever leaching lye, but I can remember them buying lye up at the hardware store and then using that to make their soap with. And like campfire soap, if you don't know what campfire soap is you take a little bit, you got your fat in your cast iron pan that you just cooked your food over the campfire on. You take a couple of handfuls of the cold wood ash out of your campfire, throw that in with the fat, mix that in. That is basically a rudimentary soap that you could use to, clean your cast iron pans when you're out on the trail or out camping or whatever. And that's kind of what campfire soap is. I hope that answers your question there a little bit. Have I ever done anything with soybeans out of the field? No, I never have done nothing with soybeans, because those soybeans, they're basically animal feed, what they grow, or they're for export over to the Asian countries. And then they actually, to make soybeans edible, that has to be pounded, and then that has to be fermented, because you can't digest a soybean. So I have never done anything with soybeans, and soybeans are sort of a modern thing. When they grew beans around here, when I was a kid growing up, there were no soybeans. That's just the last about 20 years that they come around here. And that's basically just a cash crop. The beans that were grown around here when I was a kid were basically navy beans or Great Northerns. And now they do small red beans, and they do pinto beans, and they do black beans as well around here. But when I was a kid growing up, it was just strictly navy beans. But I've never done anything with soybeans. But if I had, now, on the flip side of the coin, if I had 25 chickens in the backyard, or I was raising some pheasants or something like that, then I would take soybeans, and I would use soybeans because they have such a high fat content. And birds, especially this time of year when there's a lot of cold weather, birds have a really high metabolism, and they burn a lot of energy this time of year. So anything that's got any type of fat content, and they got a higher nutritional content, birds need that stuff. And that's why soybean meal is so prevalent for livestock feed, because it gives them that nutrition. Old hickory knives. Yeah, a lot of the old hickory knives are very similar to, what the older style knives are. I've got several knives. I got boning knives. I've got actual butcher knives. I got some that are more like what a French cooking knife is. And another thing too with these knives, like Mom's here, these knife blades were typically made out of the same steel that these saws, when these saws would break or they wouldn't be any good anymore, they would trace out the shape of the knife on this steel. They would cut that out, and then they would actually attach handles onto that, and they would sharpen that. And they would use this saw steel to make knives after this saw was no longer serviceable. And I actually have a couple of knives that were made out of saw blades like that, because that saw blade metal had a good temper to it, and it had a good spring to it. So it actually made very good knives. And most knives that weren't mass produced, but look very similar to this, with either rivets put in, or sometimes there was even glue that was used to glue the handles on, like a contact cement. That is, that's what they would do with some of the old saw blades, is they would make knives out of them. Hey there, Teresa Buchanan, Tactical Muffin Top. How you guys doing? Oh, yes, definitely. Stay fit, stack food and water. Oh, yeah. And you know what? You know, this is a good time of year, Christmas and the holidays and stuff. It's a good time to build community, you know, getting to know your neighbors and stuff. You know, I'm fortunate because I've lived in this town my whole life, but you know, people have aversion to face-to-face meetings anymore because of the internet and everything that we got with social media. And I think that's one of the negative down things with social media is people just don't talk to each other face to face anymore. And some of the troll type comments and stuff that you get, you know, back in the day, if you would have said some of that stuff to people face to face, you know, 50, 60 years ago, what people say to other people on the internet now, you would have got punched in the mouth. And, you know, that kind of stuff nowadays is pretty common online because nobody's interacting face to face on that. And here's another goodie that I got here. And this guy is what's called a bean pot. And bean pots were basically little crocks with lids, and they would use these to make baked beans. Or one of the things that my dad always liked, he would make split peas. And what they would do, they would use these. So if you'd fire up the oven, and this was a particularly with like wood stoves and cook stoves. So you had a wood-fired cook stove. It was bread baking day. You'd go ahead and you know, set your dough and make 4 loaves of bread or whatever. Well, you'd have all that residual heat in your stove, so you didn't want to waste that heat. So then you would make something like beans or split peas and ham. You would make that and you would put that in the back of the stove to cook with that extra heat from where you were baking bread. So, and I got a video on that too, where Dad took broth, ham, potatoes, and green split peas, and he would mix that into an onion, and he would put that into a bean pot like this, put the lid on it, and then that would go in the back of the oven to just soak up that residual heat from the oven. And you got sort of like a stew that came out of that ham and split pea stew with the potatoes and stuff in it. And I actually love it. It's great. That's great stuff right there. And that's what they would use these for. They would use these to cook, you know, cook their beans in. And then baked beans were the same thing. You know, they would take beans that were soaked and simmered, and they would throw them in here with some bacon, a little bit of molasses or maple syrup, brown sugar, maybe an onion. They would throw that all in there, mix that up good, and they would do the same thing. They would throw that into their oven, cover that, and that you were just using that residual heat from the oven to basically make one of the side dishes for your meal. And I actually have a couple of these, a couple of different sizes, but this is the one that I usually use most of the time, and I actually love it. Like I said, that split pea and ham, and it's not really a soup. It's too thick to be a soup. It's more like a stew in the consistency and the thickness. But those were another thing that was very, very popular. And got on one other thing here, you guys, and these things all go together. And well, Grandma, first I better explain a little bit on this, but my grandmother and my grandfather, they were milk producers, and they actually produced a lot of milk during the war, and a lot of that milk and those dairy products that went for you know, the war effort and whatnot. And they had a building that was called a condensery, and that condensery is where they took the milk after they milked the cows out there, and they would let the cream, they would let that settle. So the cream would come to the top, and then they could separate the cream off of the milk. And that's actually how you get your cream. Well, then the cream could be processed into butter. And they used their own cream to make their butter. They didn't go buy butter. And I remember Grandma saying that specifically. They took the cream from their cattle, from their milk cows, and they made their own butter out of that. I can't remember Grandma ever saying that they made cheese, but they made butter, and the buttermilk always got used for pancakes, biscuits, that kind of stuff. So they used the butter, and they used the buttermilk. So the cream they used. So they made their own butter. And this is their butter churn, what they used. And this was actually used quite a bit. And I remember being like 8, 9 years old. I remember cranking on this thing. They would take the lid off of this, and they would fill that about half full, maybe 2/3 full of that fresh cream, and then you would crank. You'd sit there and you just crank on this, until you got tired. And eventually that would ball up in here and you'd have a big old ball of butter in here. And then you would take the top off and you would dump that out. And then you would have to knead that butter to get the buttermilk out of. Well, then for kneading that out, you needed a bowl. And this is Grandma and Grandpa's bowl that they used to knead butter in. So they would dump that butter in there. They would strain off as much buttermilk as they could, and then they would take the paddle and they would work that, and they would work that, and you would get more buttermilk out of that butter, and you would keep working that until that became a solid ball of butter. Then if they wanted to salt it, they would put a little salt on that. They would roll that up and they would put that in wax paper. And then there'd be a roll of butter to be used, for whatever that you needed it for. But the butter needed to be worked after it was made. And this is what they used this for. And I've actually made butter with this multiple times. And I will say this. That works good for making butter, but if you have a KitchenAid mixer works really well, kind of a modern way to do it. If you have access to a lot of cream, and it's got to be regular cream, it can't be like ultra pasteurized, whatever. It can be pasteurized, but not if it's got the ultra pasteurized thing on that, that changes the chemical structure. You're not going to get butter out of that. But sometimes, like during the holidays and stuff this time of year, they'll get a bunch of cream in for holiday stuff and it won't sell. And there's been many times like around Christmas or right after Christmas where I got cream for like dirt cheap, and then I would go ahead and I'll make butter out of that. So that's another reason why I want to mention that, because that's this type of year thing. And then if they wanted the butter to be fancy, they would put it into a butter mold. And then this is a butter mold, and this butter mold was actually made this guy was actually made by a carpenter friend of my mother's, and because we didn't have an actual old school butter mold, and Mom wanted a butter mold. So then what they would do is you would take this, you would put the little plunger in there like so, pull the handle off here, put that back in there. They would put that in there like so, and they would take this and they would put wax paper in here. Then they would pack that butter in there, and then they would let that chill, and then when they were ready they would push that out and then take the wax paper off it. Then you had your nice little block cube of butter that you could set on your plate or whatever to have on the kitchen table or whatever. So then that's what this guy was used for. This was a butter mold. And then sometimes they would actually have little patterns carved, like flowers and stuff carved on the plunger, and then that would actually press into the butter, and you would have a little design on your butter if you really wanted to make it fancy. But all those things, here, I'll pull this up here, show you this one, show you the top on this. This was one of those things that got used a lot out at my grandparents'. Is, like I said, they produced milk during the war, but then butter was one of the things that they used from the cream and stuff. And they would fill those large milk cans, and that they would come out every couple of days. They would come out and they would pick all that milk up, and then that milk would get shipped into the war effort. But yeah, that was some of the stuff here. I think I gone over everything here that I got setting out. And now if you want, I'll answer a few questions for you guys. I haven't been watching all the what's been going on there in the live stream because I wanted to kind of show and tell all the stories with that stuff. But that is some of the items that I use. And like I said, all of these things here, I've all had these in previous videos. I've done videos on the ham and the split peas and grinding with the coffee maker and making butter. I've got, and I'll put in the description of this live stream when I'm done here. I'll put links for all those videos in if you guys haven't seen any of them or whatever. But Harry Morgan, this is a history class for me. Yeah, like I said, and it's a shame that some of these just basic things haven't been passed on and haven't been people don't know how to. I'll bet you'd ask 90 out of 100 people on the street how to make butter. 90 of them wouldn't even know the first thing is, and it's a very simple thing. And even like separating, like if you milk a cow, You know, if you let the milk set, the cream separates just naturally. You could set that and then the cream will come to the top and you can, skim the cream. You really don't need anything special to skim the cream off the top of that once you milk the cow if you're actually doing it yourself. But these are all things that, people just don't know anymore. And it's just it's a shame because we got to this point in society by the you hear this from time to time, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and that's very true. All the stuff that we have and we take for granted today, somebody had to figure out how to do all that stuff, and that basic old knowledge is kind of gotten lost because technology is going to take care of that, or a company is going to just do that for us. We don't have to worry about that anymore. But I think it's important that we know where all this stuff comes from, and then take it into a prepper context. Everything that I kind of talked about here, if there was a major collapse and we had to roll the clock back 100 years because something happened to all of our technology, everything that I talked about here would become relevant again. Being able to shape wood to make basic things, being able to cook with the residual heat of something else that you were doing, being able to grind your own grain or coffee, or make your own chicken feed, being able to make your own butter, being able to cut your own firewood. Everything that I've showed you guys here is something that would become important to know again. So that's kind of the why I always emphasize some of these older skills, is because they are very relevant if some SHTF situation would happen. Hey there, Sunset. How you doing? Got snow up there in New York today? Yeah, we got pounded pretty good. I'm going to say we had about 10 inches here is what we had. Some of it melted up a little bit, but it was pretty chilly again last night. We were kind of in the mid 20s today, so the snow ain't going to go anywhere today, even in the sunshine. Great way to finish a jar up by 10 pounds of 7-pound bag of sweet potatoes. We'll throw in the canner. Yeah, sweet potatoes. I actually had a pretty good crop of sweet potatoes that I grew in 5-gallon pails a couple years back, and it was just how do I want to say it? It was toward the end of the season at the greenhouse, and they had sweet potato vines. And I said, I'm going to try them out. And I put them in some 5-gallon buckets with some compost, and we got, I think, 3, maybe 4 meals of sweet potatoes is what we got out of those 5-gallon buckets. And they just vined out all over the place, and I just let them do their thing. I made sure that they had plenty of water and stuff and plenty of sunshine, and they actually turned out really, really well. Any idea how many pounds of butter you would get from a gallon of cream? You would get quite a bit. Now, that container right there, that butter churn, I am going to say is 2 gallons. And when I have made butter in that butter churn, I got a lump of butter probably about probably about the size of a mushmelon is what I got in there. And that, I would have to say, would probably be about 2.5 pounds. So I would say that you're going to get a little over a pound of butter out of 1 gallon of cream. So I would say about 1.5 pounds out of a gallon, if I remember correctly, what we got out of that. But then, you got the buttermilk too. And the buttermilk, it reduces to a certain extent, it reduces in volume. But that homemade buttermilk, there's something about that. I don't know if it's the acid content or what it is, that reacts with baking soda so well. You will have the best pancakes and you will have the best biscuits ever if you use that homemade buttermilk. The thing with the homemade buttermilk is the homemade buttermilk, it doesn't keep forever, even in a refrigerator. I don't know what it is about it, but when you get it, it's one of those things, when you have it, you're going to use it right away. You're not going to want to put that up or anything, because it doesn't keep it. Eventually it'll kind of get funky on you. But I would say you're probably good for at least 1.5 pounds of butter out of a gallon of cream. But like I said, then you got the butter always costs more than the cream does, and the same thing with a buttermilk. So if you were like bartering or swapping or whatever, and you had actually really good fresh butter. I mean, look at Amish butter. You look at Amish butter in like the stores and stuff. They charge twice the price of that over what just a regular butter is. Uh, hey, Brad, how you doing there, buddy? Don't let the milk set too long, otherwise it separates and begins to stink. See, the condensery at Grandma and Grandpa's, that was an unheated outbuilding. And so, they had a lot of their natural refrigeration. And I remember they had a little bit of running water that went through that too. And how do I want to say this? It was almost like a little bit of a creek or a ditch that ran past that where the milk house was there and stuff too. And the way they had that set up, I always remember going into that milk house when I was a kid. It was always cool in there. So I don't know if it was the block construction or how they had that set up, but it was always very, very cool in that condensery, because that's what they called it, was the condensery. Uh, what did they plant for chickens, if any? Chickens basically got a combination of corn, oats, and wheat. And wheat was very rich. If the chickens got too much wheat, they would get the poops. So they would, it was basically oats and crack corn. They would crack the corn, they would grind the oats, and then they would mix maybe like 10% wheat into that, because wheat was really, really rich. And that is more or less what they fed the animals. And I remember in the granary when I was a kid, there Grandpa had a barn. When you drove in, there was like a courtyard where in the barn, the one barn sat in the back, and then the cow barn was back behind that. Then there was the chicken coop was on this side, and then there was another lane that went back, and then that's where the corn crib was. The corn crib had corn on the cob in the corn crib, and then there was wheat, oats, and beans is what was in the granary of that front barn. So they actually had rooms inside that barn. And then on the loft, they had the hay, and then they had their equipment stored on the back side. But the one side there, and that was all cement rooms. There was cement floors, there was cement walls, and then they'd had a wooden roof, because then that was the hay mow where the hay was in. And in that granary there, that is where they stored their oats and their beans and their wheat and stuff. So if they needed that ground up, they would grind it, and then they would mix that for the chickens. But that's basically what they fed the chickens. Should your new grandma refugee? I don't know. I don't think she likes. I know she doesn't like me. I can say grandma, but if I say any of them other grandma-ish type words, I get the stink eye there from other refugees. So I don't want to get her fired up at me. And great grandma is even worse. When we take the baby over to the care facility for great grandma, she's another one. She doesn't like it. You're not going to be calling her granny. You're going to get the old grumpy look for sure. Patriot preacher, are you day drinking? I am, but it's stuff to keep keep the congestion down. They wanted me to take that congestion medicine, but I haven't taken any yet. Does someone own your grandparents' farm now? Yeah, the farm got sold, and a couple of the barns got saved, but everything else got tore down, and it's all plowed up. It's I know right where it is, and I can remember where everything was, but it's a far cry from what it used to be. I actually have, and I did a video on that, what the old farm looked like, and I had it on the thumbnail, and I think I showed pictures of it too. I have an aerial photograph of the old place pre-World War II. And if I remember correctly, it was 1937 is what was written on that, because they did some type of aerial survey around here in the late 30s, and they took pictures of the farms, and then they asked the farmers if they wanted to buy a picture of what their farm looked like. And I have an aerial photograph of the farm, and of course it had the garden and the orchard, and it had the smokehouse back out behind the house, and it had the condensery, and it had all the barns, and there was a garage in the front where they had their one car in and stuff, and they had the driveway coming in. The driveway was lined with trees, and then the front acre or two, because it was along the road and it was along a curve in the road. Well, along that curve part of the road there, that front couple of acres that was in there, that's where Grandpa planted wheat actually for the family. And that wheat was harvested, and that's what they used to grind their flour for their own bread. And then, of course, like I said, they had an orchard, and they had chickens, and they had the dairy, they had the dairy operation and stuff going on, and they had the water tanks and pumps there so they could keep the livestock going and fed. And Grandpa had bees. Grandpa was actually a beekeeper. In fact, I found, when my mother passed away, I found some of the old antique beekeeping stuff, and I don't have any use for that because I'm living here in town and stuff. But there was a lady that I worked with. She actually kept bees, so I thought it was nice. So I gave those antique beekeeping things to her because I figured she, could, maybe even utilize them or whatnot. But yeah, Grandma and Grandpa's place there, that was a very self-sufficient farm, and they produced a lot of stuff. Plus, they had the woods, and I still own the woods today. But the woods today is not near as what it was before. Well, the woods was actually partial pasture at that time. So then they had beef cattle out in that pasture, but then they had the woods, and that's where they cut firewood out of. And they had wood cook stove at the house, but then they also had electricity too, and they had a very large basement, and the basement had, more than enough space to store all their canning stuff. They had an old freezer, very large chest freezer. They had barrels in there because Grandpa made wine, so there was always a couple of wine barrels down there. Plus, there was room for all the crocks and whatnot, so they had their lard and stuff down there, and they could lard meat. And then the smokehouse had everything, the sausage and the ham and the bacon and all that stuff that just hung out in the smokehouse. And whenever they wanted that stuff, they went out there this time of year and they would cut that out, and they would bring that in. So really the only modern thing that they ever had really was that electric freezer, and even their wash machine. I remember they had an old wringer washer, and one day a week, Mom would go over there with me when I was a little kid, and they ran that wringer washer to wash the clothes for the week. There was one day that was a washing day that they did. But like I said, they had everything old school yet at Grandma and Grandpa's old farm. And the one story, and I've told this in other videos and stuff before, where Grandpa, after World War II, the winters were very severe. So like 46 through 49, 50, they had very severe winters. And the one time the blizzard came through here, and it was so bad, all the roads were plowed shut, and they were plowed shut for weeks. And they actually had to bring in snow removal equipment from the Upper Peninsula to clear the roads from up here because they didn't have that type of equipment in this part of Michigan at the time. But Grandpa still had a team of horses with a sleigh, so that's how he picked up the kids and delivered, got the kids back home to where they belong, so they didn't have to walk in that blizzard and stuff. And then that's if somebody needed something from town or whatever, he would go uptown with a sleigh and get, because you couldn't get through with wheeled vehicles, you couldn't get through. So he was sort of the lifeblood of the neighborhood because he had teams of horses, yet draft horses, and he had a sleigh. Ah. You take care, Brad. We'll see you. But yeah, that's kind of some of the stories there from Grandpa's old farm. You are a great family historian. Well, I appreciate that, Henry. Like I said, I'm just trying to pass on the stuff that I think people need to know. Just jarred up gallons of pork lard, white and lovely. Oh, I like. I tell you what, there's nothing better than biscuits made with a little bit of lard or pie crust. And of course, probably the people up in the UP, the making pasties, because that's basically just a pie crust. Yeah, and the lard, I got, our room in the basement where we keep our pantry and keep our stuff in there. I I keep my lard when I render some lard. I keep it in Crocks. I got one meat place around here. They'll sell me fat pretty cheap, and I have actually rendered lard. I have a rendering lard video too. But then you get the cracklins afterward. You can take the cracklins and mix a little of that in your cornbread and have some crackling bread. That's good stuff too. But yeah, there's nothing bad about rendering lard. Yeah, I mean the lard that you get is awesome for stuff. And again, that's stuff too. Nowadays, people have no idea. And, with the whole fat and the cholesterol and everything, people nowadays they don't realize that you actually need fat to survive, especially if it's colder outside. Because you'll burn a lot of fat. But yeah, lard was definitely a commodity. I mean, even lard and meat. I can remember the different old guys talking about lard and pork steaks and sausage and that kind of stuff. But yeah, that was also a very popular way of preserving meat. But nothing bad in all that stuff. That stuff all got used. And again, you go to 100 people on the street and you ask them, how you produce lard, nobody would know. And saying about how much fat that you burn in cold weather climates, I remember I read it was actually in a magazine, if I remember right. There were a couple of guys back in the early 2000s. They circumnavigated Greenland in sea kayaks, and they had about so much food that they had set aside, and they were figuring on, if I remember correctly, they were figuring on like 4 to 4,500 calories a day, because they were working paddling the sea kayaks. Plus, it was cold outside, and they were consuming their food, but then they had a certain amount of fat that they were consuming along with the stuff that they had there to keep their calories up, and they were starving because they didn't have enough fat in their diet. They had that figured wrong, and they did make it all the way around Greenland, but both of them had lost like 25 pounds. They were basically skin and bones when they got done, and they were eating over 4,000 calories a day, and they still lost all that weight because of all the calories they were burning, not only paddling the sea kayaks, but also to stay warm because of the climate. So, there is a reason why you need fat, and if you live on the equator, you might not need as much of that. But up here in the northern latitudes, you need that extra fat to survive. Oh no, you cannot make any type of tamales are to be made with lard. Definitely. Oh yeah, the Amish know a lot. If you can gain their trust, you got to be able to, prove, you know, you're you're still the English to the Amish, but you got to prove, if you can prove yourself to them that you're truly interested in their ways and their way of life, and you respect how they're living and stuff, you could go a long way. And another thing, if you want to get in with the Amish, is you sprechen a little Deutsch. If you can speak a little German to them, even just basic few words or whatever, that gets you in good too. And that's where my mother was so good with, because this was a German community. So when she would interact with the Amish, she would always try to speak German or the Low German that they would speak, and that always got her in good. And I remember one time in particular, it was getting toward the end of where Mom was staying at the farm there, and the one day, because they had a wood slash coal stove in the old farmhouse, and Mom wanted to try burning a little coal again. And she told me, she said, I want a little coal. I want to put a little coal in the wood stove here and burn it. Of course, I didn't, really know that much about that stuff. And she said that the Amish guy over in one of the closer towns, she said that Amish guy sells anthracite. I want some of that anthracite coal. So I went over there and I talked to the old guy, big old Amish beard on him, white. He was probably in his early 60s, I would say. And at that time, I was probably 30. And I went over there and I said, "Hey, my mom wants some anthracite coal." And he's like, "Oh, she's got a coal stove." And I'm like, "No, it's just a wood stove." And he's like, "Oh, that anthracite, that's not going to burn in that coal stove. You got to have a special stove and this and that to burn that anthracite." And I'm like, I don't know, man. That's all she said she wanted. She said she wanted a couple of bags of anthracite. So that's what I'm here for. And he begrudgingly sold me that anthracite coal. And I don't know, it was like in 50-pound bags or something. I bought maybe 4 bags or whatever. And I took that over to, mom and dad's place and loaded it for them the way they wanted to. And I told mom what had happened. I said, this old Amish guy said, you can't burn that in a wood stove. And Ma's like, he just doesn't know how to do it. She goes, I know how to do that. She said, you just got to give it some more air and you got to work the dampers a certain way and whatever. But she said the anthracite will keep a little more heat in it um, in the coldest part of the winter there. That way, she says, I don't have to fire the stove so much at night. I can put some of that anthracite in there and that'll keep the heat then until morning. And then I don't have to mess around, or if mom said, I don't have to piss around as much to, get the fire going then in the morning when I get up. I'm like, oh, all right, no problem. And she said, the next time you go over there, she said, I want to go over there and I want to talk to him. So I'm like, all right, no problem, whatever. So anyway, when mom had those couple bags used up, whatever, and she said, I want a couple more bags of that. And I'm like, all right, you want to go along? And she said, yeah. So we went over there and boy, mom, she marched right in there and she started talking German with that guy. And by the time it was all said and done, he had no problem selling mom those bags of anthracite coal because, they were actually selling the anthracite coal stoves over there. So I think he thought that everybody, should buy one of his stoves or whatever, but I don't know. Mom kind of set him straight that you can burn it. You just got to know how to give the oxygen into that stuff and whatnot. But I remember that was one of the old stories too from the Amish, where mom, like I said, mom never shied away from the Amish. She always tried to get in there and speak the German with them and go back and forth. It was the same thing for the butcher. The slow one slaughterhouse where we would get the one farmer that mom dealt with, where we would get our beef from, because we would get a quarter of beef, in the fall. And the old guy's name was Gene that ran the place. And mom, she would go in there and talk with Gene, and she would take homemade wine because mom still made wine. So she'd take a couple mason jars of wine in there and give that to Gene, and Gene would take her right back into the smokehouse, whatever, and he would give her some smoked sausage or some Braunschweiger or whatever, or some liver sausage. So we would always come home with a couple of rings of bologna or whatever whenever we went over there, because mom and Gene both spoke German. So they would chat and talk about whatever it was that they talked about, and she'd give him homemade wine, and we'd come home with sausage or liver sausage or whatever that she gave them. But yeah, very, very, very good memories. CV Farmer, we fed baby calves fat, and when it got cold outside, so that they wouldn't lose weight. Yeah, you will lose weight if you do not have access to fat. If you don't have access to fat when it gets cold outside. Hey there, Michigan Silverback. Oh yeah, single store butchers and bakeries. Every town had a bakery. When I was a kid around here, every town had a bakery. We had a bakery here in this town. The town that's just a little bit south of us, a couple of miles, they had a specific bakery because mom, if she didn't like, she would want to go get something from the bakery. Sometimes she'd want to go to the other bakery, so she would. Every town had a bakery. Now I am only aware in our county here, there's one large bakery yet in the county, at the county seat. Other than that, I can't think of any other bakeries. They got a couple of little posh, like high-end bakeries where they make the really fancy cookies and cupcakes and stuff, but an old school bakery where they made 3 or 4 different kinds of breads. Well, then they made donuts and stuff like that too. But the old school bakery that made, like, you could get like rye bread, and you could get pantry, what they call pantry bread, that you slice yourself. They have that here in our county, but there's only one place anymore that still makes that. And every town, when I was a kid growing up, every town had a bakery. And bigger towns, like if you go to Bay City had a half a dozen different bakeries. I still remember where a couple bakeries were that have closed up since then, where mom took us, because, a bakery was something that, the Amish community still have bakeries. Like if you go over to Clare, if I remember correct, the last time I was over there anyway, I remember that there was an Amish bakery there where they had the bread and stuff. They had other stuff too. They had some sweets and stuff too, but most of those bakeries, that was strictly for bread. But most Amish communities will still have a bakery. Uh, Yeah, they just all went by the wayside with all the commercial, with all the commercial bakeries. Are you full German? I believe I am full German because everybody around here was German and both of my families were German. But you can never tell because sometimes those records get mixed up and whatnot because I do have green eyes. So, I probably got an Irishman in the back there somewhere, but both of my families were German, and my father's family especially because when my dad was still alive, him and his cousin, they made an entire. They went through and they found all the stuff from that side of the family, and they still had a relative yet that lived in Germany, and he was in contact with them, and they had all that. So my father's side of the family, I'm sure I'm 100%, German, but um, my mother's side of the family, they were German too, but then that was a little bit different. Like my grandmother's or my grandfather's mother, she actually came from Germany, and then the guy she married was supposedly German, but I don't know what his most of the knowledge that I have. The genealogy knowledge that I have from my mother's side of the family comes from my grandmother, and but my grandfather's past where my grandfather and his three brothers, I know their story kind of, but then back past farther than that, I'm not quite so sure on. So I'm going to say I'm at least 75% German, but I could be 100% too. Oh yeah, Coney, shoe repairs, fixing belts, purses, holsters. There was a guy in town. His last name was Yakeley, and he had he had a store. And when I was in like high school, he had a lot of like hobby stuff, and he had craft stuff and but whatnot. But what he had in the back, he had the old leather sewing machines, and he had the old heavy duty sewing machine. So like if you had a heavy Carhartt work coat or something and the zipper broke, he could replace that. He could sew through that heavy canvas and stuff. And he actually stitched and sewed leather. And, that was something that old towns had. So if you had some shoes or you need something to be repaired, he would actually repair that for you. You take in one of those big heavy coats and, for $10 or whatever, he would put in a heavy brass zipper into that. And, otherwise a regular sewing machine couldn't sew through that heavy canvas material that those old Carhartts were made out of. And, that was something that this town had too back in the day. Oh yeah, I enjoy my reminiscing too, and like I said, a lot of that stuff that I reminisce about has modern uses here in preparedness because if you got to start doing some of that stuff yourself, it isn't always about spending money on the internet preparedness. If you have some of these old skills and some of these old tools and you kind of have a basic knowledge on how they work, it can really help you out in the long run. Oh, I'm sorry about the ad things there, Sunset. I wish I had some more control over that. I wish they just roll the ad like at the beginning and the end, but YouTube does whatever they want with that. I wish I could do a little bit more about that, but unfortunately, I don't have any control over that. Oh yeah, those and I don't know whatever happened to those heavy duty sewing machines and that stuff in there after he passed away. I don't know because they were massive. They were big pieces of equipment. Whatever happened to them, they probably got sold for scrap, which would just break my heart. But I'm sure that's probably what happened. Well, guys, I have been on here a little over an hour now. I hope you guys enjoyed this mid-afternoon chat here. I really did, just talking about some of this old stuff, showing some of this old stuff here, and showing some of the stories and some of the things that I know by this. But if you know anybody that's interested in any of this old stuff, tell them about this live stream. They can catch the replay on it. I think I covered everything here about as good as I can from my own recollection. But I really appreciate you guys taking some time out of your afternoon here to spend with me, and Mother Refugee, who's keeping me on the straight and narrow here. But I appreciate each and every one of you guys out there. I hope you guys always get something out of my videos. If it's not a tip or a trick, it's a good memory from the past, or it's a recollection. I got so many people that'll say to me, and when I talk about the older things, that I jar some old pleasant memory that they had, and that's kind of the run of the reasons why I do this, on top of the preparedness and whatnot, because our world is, unfortunately, our world is very unstable, and I hope that one day that can change. But right now, the best thing that we can do is just take care of ourselves and our family and our friends and the people in our communities, and just do the best we can with what we have. But anyways, Modern Refugee, appreciate all my subscribers out there. Hope you guys always get some information, some entertainment out of my videos. You guys have a great afternoon.